The security guard didn't even look at her when he held the door open. Just stood there with his arms crossed while she carried her own bag out, badge already pulled from her lanyard, the plastic slapping against the linoleum one last time before she pushed through into the gray morning air. Behind her, Administrator Harlan Voss was already walking back toward his office. Job done. Problem gone. 37 minutes later, military helicopters tore through the sky above Crestview Medical Center, and 36 soldiers in critical condition were being rushed through those same automatic doors. And the first question out of the commanding officer's mouth wasn't, "Where's the trauma team?" or "Is the OR ready?" It was, "Where is Emily Carter?" If this story hits you, subscribe, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The morning started the way most bad ones did, quietly, without warning, with nothing to mark it as different from any other Tuesday. Emily Carter clocked in at 6:48 a.m., which was 12 minutes before her shift officially began. She did that every day. Not because anyone asked her to, not because she was gunning for Employee of the Month or angling for a raise, but because the overnight crew was always running behind and there was always someone who needed something before the handoff was clean. She knew that rhythm. She'd learned it a long time ago, in places where being 12 minutes early wasn't a professional courtesy. It was the difference between a patient making it and a patient not. Crestview Medical Center sat in the middle of Redstone, a mid-sized city in the Appalachian foothills that had been growing faster than its infrastructure could handle for the better part of a decade. The hospital had expanded twice in 5 years, the newest wing still smelling faintly of fresh drywall behind the antiseptic. The ER was chronically understaffed. The billing department had more personnel than the ICU. Most of the nurses knew this and said nothing, because the ones who'd said something had a way of quietly disappearing from the schedule. Emily had been at Crestview for 2 years. She was 31, compact and steady in the way that people who've had to be steady become, with dark circles that never fully went away and a habit of moving through rooms like she was already calculating exits. She wasn't unfriendly, she just didn't waste words. The night crew was short a body. Marcus Webb had called out sick, which meant Diane Okafor had been running the East Corridor alone since midnight. Diane was 53 and had been a nurse for 26 years, and she still looked like she'd been ridden hard when Emily found her at the station doing chart notes with one hand and holding a coffee cup with the other. "Go home," Emily said, taking the chart. "I'm fine." "You're not." Emily glanced at the notes. 302's Foley needs to be repositioned. 298 is 2 hours past her pain management window, and you spelled urinalysis 3 different ways on this one page. Go home, Diane. Diane looked at her for a second, then put down the coffee. East Corridor's all yours. I know. She was 2 patients in when she noticed the chart discrepancy. Room 304, Gerald Pfeiffer, 68 years old, admitted 2 nights ago with suspected cardiac complications. His medication log showed he'd received his morning dose of metoprolol at 6:15 a.m. The night nurse's initials were there, timestamp and everything, but the blister pack in the medication cart was still full, and when Emily checked the secondary log that the pharmacy used for tracking controlled dispersals, Pfeiffer's name wasn't in it. That happens sometimes. Paperwork getting ahead of actual administration, someone initialing before they'd finished rounds and forgetting to go back. It was a common enough error, and it was correctable. What wasn't correctable was giving a cardiac patient his beta blocker twice, which would happen in about 40 minutes when the day shift pharmacist ran distribution. Emily flagged it, logged a hold in the system, and went to confirm with Pfeiffer directly. He was awake, reading a news magazine with his glasses pushed up on his forehead. "Morning," she said. "Did someone already bring you your heart medication this morning? White pill, small, oval?" He thought about it. "Nurse came in around 6, but she left before I took it. Said she'd be right back and then never came." "Okay," Emily made a note. "I'll get it taken care of." She was back at the station redocumenting the discrepancy when she heard him. Harlan Voss. You could always hear Harlan Voss before you saw him. Not because he was loud, exactly, but because he carried himself with the particular weight of a man who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around his arrival. 54 years old, hospital administrator for 11 years. The kind of institutional authority that came not from competence but from tenure and the willingness to make people uncomfortable. His shoes were expensive. His tie was always straight. He had a handshake that lasted slightly too long. He came around the corner with two people behind him, Sandra Reeve, the floor supervisor, and a man Emily didn't recognize in a suit that wasn't a scrub's. "Carter." Voss stopped at the station. Not a greeting, just her name, like a period at the end of a sentence. "Mr. Voss." She kept her eyes on the chart she was updating. "I need to speak with you. Now." She set down the pen, looked at him. "I'm in the middle of a medication flag for 304. Cardiac patient, dosing error from last night. It needs to go to pharmacy before 6:30 distribution. Sandra can handle it. It's already logged. I just need 2 minutes to—" "Carter." His voice dropped half a register. "Now." She followed them to the small conference room at the end of the corridor, the one with the frosted glass door that people called the fishbowl because you could see shapes through it even if you couldn't hear anything. Sandra closed the door behind them. The man in the suit stood near the window with a folder. "This is Mr. Garrett Dunn," Voss said. "Risk management." Dunn opened the folder. He had the practiced neutrality of someone who did this regularly and didn't enjoy it. "Ms. Carter, we've reviewed a complaint filed against you yesterday evening regarding the care of a patient in room 301. Her mind went to 301. Thomas Ardell, 42, admitted for a respiratory complication following a routine procedure at an outpatient clinic. She'd had him for 2 shifts. What kind of complaint? The patient's wife reported that her husband was left unmonitored for an extended period during a respiratory episode on Sunday evening. She claims a nurse, identified as you by 2 witnesses, failed to respond appropriately to his call signal. Emily looked at him steadily. That's not what happened. Can you account for your actions between 7 and 7:40 p.m. on Sunday? Yes. I was with a patient in 297 who was in respiratory distress. I triaged both situations, determined 297 was more acute, called for backup on 301 through the station, and stayed with 297 until she stabilized. I logged all of it. The backup call is not in the system, Sandra said. She had the tone of someone delivering information she'd been coached to deliver. Then someone deleted it or it didn't save because I made it. Voss leaned against the table. He didn't look angry exactly. He looked like he'd already decided something. Ms. Carter, this isn't the first concern we've had regarding your conduct. What concerns? Specifically? There have been notes. What notes? Internal communications regarding your behavior on the floor, complaints from colleagues about your communication style. She almost laughed. My communication style. You have a pattern of operating unilaterally, making clinical decisions above your scope, undermining supervisory authority. I've flagged medication errors. I've caught documentation gaps that would have caused patient harm. If that's undermining supervisory authority, enough. Voss straightened. We've conducted a review. Given the severity of the complaint regarding Mr. Ardell and considering the broader pattern of conduct, we're terminating your employment effective immediately. The room went very quiet. Emily sat with that for a moment. She could feel Sandra not looking at her. Dunn had closed the folder. I want to see the documentation, she said. The complaint, the internal notes, all of it. You'll receive copies in your exit packet. I want to see them now. That's not how this process works. Then I want to speak to the board. Voss smiled. It didn't reach anything above his mouth. You can submit a formal grievance through HR, which takes approximately 60 days to process. He checked his watch. I'm going to need your badge. She didn't move for a second. She was thinking about Pfeiffer in 304, about the metoprolol flag she'd filed, about whether Sandra would actually catch it before distribution. She was thinking about Ardell in 301 and the fact that she had triaged correctly and that someone had made sure the system didn't reflect that. She was thinking about a lot of things very fast, the way she'd been trained to think, triage, and priority, and what could actually be fixed right now and what couldn't. She unclipped her badge and set it on the table. The patient in 304 has a medication flag in the system, she said, keeping her voice level. Cardiac case, beta blocker discrepancy. Someone needs to contact pharmacy before 6:30. No one responded. She picked up her bag from under the station, said nothing else, and walked to the elevator. The lobby of Crestview Medical Center was starting to come to life. The morning shift arriving, coffee cups and lanyards, the security desk doing the changeover. The guard at the front, a young guy, maybe 24, somebody she'd said good morning to for 2 years, was already holding the door when she reached it. He didn't look at her. She walked through. The morning air was cold and damp and smelled like the mountains that ring the city, that particular mix of pine and diesel and altitude. Emily stood on the sidewalk outside the main entrance for a moment, bag over one shoulder, no badge, no lanyard, the automatic doors sliding shut behind her. She did not cry. She stood there and breathed and looked at the parking lot filling up with the day shift, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, they're going to have a staffing problem on East Corridor. Then she thought about where she'd parked and started walking. She sat in her car for a while. Not long, maybe 10 minutes. She had a specific way of going still that she'd developed over years of operating in environments where falling apart was not an option, and she used it now. This particular internal stillness, just inventory. What was true? What she knew? What could be done? What she knew, she hadn't made the error they were citing. She knew that the way she knew her own heartbeat. She also knew that in the 2 years she'd been at Crestview, she'd caught 4 medication errors, filed 2 formal safety reports, and flagged a documentation pattern in the surgery suite that had gone nowhere. She knew that Harlan Voss had been the administrator during all of it, and that none of her reports had resulted in anything except a quiet cooling of temperature between her and the floor supervisors. She also knew that Thomas Ardell's wife had been in the room with her on Sunday evening, that she'd explained exactly why she was triaging the way she was, that the woman had nodded and said, "Okay, I trust you." And she knew that somewhere between then and now, that story had changed. What could be done? She could lawyer up. She could file the grievance. She could call the state nursing board. She started the car. She had an apartment 12 minutes from the hospital on the 3rd floor of a building that was technically called Ridgeline Residential, but that everyone in the building called the Ridgeline because the sign had been missing letters for 3 years. It was a 2-bedroom that she used as a 1-bedroom because the second room had a pull-out desk and a gun safe and filing cabinets that she hadn't unpacked since she moved in. She changed out of her scrubs, made coffee, sat down with her laptop. She was in the middle of drafting a written account of the Sunday incident, every detail she could pull up, time-stamped, cross-referenced against what she knew the system log should show, when her phone buzzed. It was a number she hadn't seen in almost 2 years. She stared at it. Then she picked up. "Carter?" The voice on the other end was familiar in the way that a sound you associate with high stress becomes familiar. Not comforting, exactly, but orienting. Major Dennis Rourke. She'd served under him for the last 18 months of her second deployment. He was methodical, direct, and chronically short on small talk. "Major?" "Not Major anymore. Retired 8 months ago. It's Dennis." A pause. "How are you?" She looked at her laptop screen, at the incident account she'd been drafting. "Having a complicated morning." "Yeah." Another pause, longer. "I'm calling because something's happened. There was a transport incident this morning about 40 miles outside Redstone. Military convoy, Route 9 bridge. You're probably not going to hear about it yet. It just happened." Her hand tightened slightly on the phone. "How bad?" "Bad enough. We've got multiple casualties being routed to the nearest trauma-capable facility." A beat. "Crestview Medical Center." She said nothing. "I know you're at Crestview," Rourke said. "I've been keeping tabs, old habit." "I'm not at Crestview anymore." Silence. "As of about 2 hours ago," she said, "I was terminated this morning." The pause that followed had a quality to it that she recognized as Rourke recalibrating. He'd always been quick at that, taking in new information and adjusting without wasted motion. "Emily," his voice had shifted. "How many casualties are we talking?" "I told you I'm not—" "I know what you told me. I'm telling you that right now there are approximately 34 military personnel, several in critical condition, being transported to a hospital that has no idea what's coming, and, if what you're telling me is accurate, just fired the one person on their staff qualified to handle this level of trauma load." His voice was quiet and absolutely serious. I'm on my way to Redstone with the incident team. How many casualties? I don't know. I'm not in the loop. Get in the loop. Use the contacts you still have in that building, the nurses who'll talk to you, anyone. Find out what they know and find out if they're prepped. Dennis, Emily, these are our people. She pressed her thumb against the bridge of her nose, closed her eyes, opened them. I'll make some calls, she said. She hung up, sat for exactly 3 seconds, then picked up the phone again and dialed Anita Delgado, who was a charge nurse in Crestview's ER and one of the 3 people in the building Emily actually trusted. Anita picked up on the second ring. Her voice was already strained. Emily? Why are you calling from... I heard what happened this morning. That is complete bull... Anita, stop. I need you to listen. Do you have word of incoming casualties? Military transport accident, mass casualty situation, possibly 30 or more. Oh God. Her voice went flat in a different way. We just got a call 2 minutes ago. EMS is rerouting half of them here because Mercy and Fallbrook is at capacity. They said at least 15 critical, maybe more. What's your trauma team availability right now? Short. We're 3 physicians down from weekend on calls that didn't get filled. We've got 1 attending in the ER, Dr. Fulton, and the surgical suite has 2 ORs running electives that would have to get cleared. A beat. Emily, what's going on? Military convoy accident on the Route 9 bridge. How's your blood supply? Why do you know about this before we do? Anita? Blood supply. She heard Anita moving, the background noise of the ER shifting. O negative is low. We had a run on it Friday. I don't know if anyone restocked. Emily, we are not ready for 15 critical. We are not ready for 10 critical right now. Honestly, Fulton is the only... Get Fulton. Tell him to clear the electives and get OR staff on standby. Start blood product verification now. And somebody needs to pull the mass casualty protocol and actually read it, not just check the box that it's posted. You can't just... I know. I'm not telling you what to do officially. I'm telling you what I'd do if I were there. You can do what you want with it. She paused. Who's on the desk? Martinez. Tell Martinez to call regional blood services and request emergency replenishment, O negative priority. Tell him it's a mass casualty situation. Emily, go, Anita. She hung up again. She sat in her kitchen with her coffee cooling on the counter, and she thought about 34 people on a road she'd driven a dozen times, a bridge she knew by name, and a hospital she'd just walked out of 2 hours ago that was about to be buried. She thought about what Rourke had said. These are our people. She pulled up her laptop again. Not the incident account anymore. She opened a different file, one she'd kept since her first week at Crestview, a detailed personal log of every clinical decision she'd made, every discrepancy she'd flagged, every interaction she'd documented in her own handwriting outside the hospital's system, because she'd been in enough environments where official records had a way of not reflecting what actually happened. She went back to the beginning and started reading. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number, Redstone area code. She answered. This is Colonel Judith Maris. The voice was clipped and precise, the tone of someone who had delivered orders in noisy environments for enough years that quiet rooms didn't slow her down. I'm the medical officer coordinating the response to the Route 9 incident. I'm looking for Emily Carter. Emily went still in a different way than before. Speaking, she said. Ms. Carter, I have your service record in front of me. I've been briefed on your qualifications and your current assignment at Crestview Medical Center. I need you to confirm your availability. There's a situation with my employment status at Crestview that I'm aware of your employment status. I'm asking about your availability, not your badge number. Emily looked at her kitchen, at the coffee she hadn't finished, at the incident account still open on her laptop, the carefully worded documentation of everything they'd done to her. What do you need? She said. Right now I need someone who can walk into that ER and assess their actual readiness level in real time, not what they tell me on the phone. We're 22 minutes out with the first transport wave, and I need ground truth. I was terminated this morning. I can't walk into their ER. As of 9 minutes ago, you're operating as a civilian trauma consultant under Emergency Military Medical Authority. Your civilian employment status is not relevant to that designation. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to make the point. Can you be at the hospital in 8 minutes? Emily closed the laptop. 7, she said. She was already reaching for her keys. The drive back to Crestview was 5 minutes, not 7. She cut through the side streets she knew, the ones that skipped the light at Denison and the backup at the hospital parking structure entrance. She pulled into the ambulance bay and got out of the car without fully processing the decision to park there. The ambulance bay was for emergency vehicles, not civilian personal cars, but she calculated that the conversation she was about to have would take longer than however long it took someone to notice the car. She pushed through the bay doors. She was 3 steps inside when she heard him. You have no business being in this building. Harlan Voss was standing at the nurse's station in the main ER corridor, and for a half second she thought he looked uncertain, the way someone looks when a situation is moving faster than their authority can manage it. But he recovered quickly. He was good at that, performing certainty even when the ground was shifting. Mr. Voss? She didn't stop walking toward the station. You need to activate your mass casualty protocol right now. You have approximately 19 minutes before the first wave of critical patients arrives. You are trespassing. I am operating under emergency military medical authority, and you will hear that confirmed in the next 4 minutes when the military medical liaison calls your front desk. She reached the station and looked past him to Anita, who was already pulling up the blood inventory screen. What's the O-negative count? 8 units, Anita said without looking up. That's not enough. She turned to Dr. Fulton, who was standing in the doorway of exam room 2 looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. He was 39, good instincts, sometimes too deferential to Voss for his own professional good. Dr. Fulton, what's your elective surgical status? Fulton glanced at Voss, one of those glances that happens in a fraction of a second but contains an entire conversation. Stand down, Carter, Voss said. His voice had gone hard. You will leave this building immediately, or I will have security remove you. The desk phone rang. Everyone looked at it. The unit secretary, a young man named Torres, who Emily had helped through a medication question his second week on the job, picked it up, listened. His face went through 3 different things in about 4 seconds. Then he held it out toward the station. It's a Colonel Maris, he said. She's asking for the medical administrator on duty and says it's a federal emergency consultation matter. Voss stared at the phone. Emily looked at him. And outside, distant at first, then building fast into something that rattled the window panes along the east corridor, came the sound of helicopter rotors. Not one, several. Voss turned toward the window. The color had shifted in his face in a way she'd never seen before, something moving under the controlled surface of it. She picked up the phone from Torres. Colonel Maris, she said. I'm on the floor. Tell me what's inbound. Inbound wave is 11 critical, 19 serious, 4 walking wounded, Maris said. Her voice had the particular quality of someone already working 3 problems simultaneously. First helicopters land in 4 minutes. I need a real-time assessment of your trauma bay capacity. Emily turned her back on Voss and moved toward the board. 2 trauma bays operational, 1 down for maintenance. Blood supply is critically short, 8 units O-negative. Surgical suite has 2 ORs running electives that need to be cleared. I have 1 ER attending. She looked at Fulton. What's your intubation kit situation? Fulton was already moving. I'll check personally. Do that and tell me about ventilator availability while you're back there. Carter. Voss again, the word landing like something thrown. You are not authorized, Mr. Voss. Maris's voice came through the handset clearly enough that Torres could hear it from 2 feet away. I need you to understand that Ms. Carter is currently operating under Emergency Military Medical Consultation Authority, Title 10, Section 1094, and any interference with her work in the next several hours will be treated as obstruction of federal emergency operations. Do you understand what I've said? The lobby outside the ER entrance had gone loud. Car doors, radio chatter, someone shouting for a wheelchair. The automatic doors opened and let in a blast of cold mountain air and the distant thud of rotor blades chewing at the sky. Voss said nothing. Do you understand, Mr. Voss? Maris repeated. Yes, he said, very quietly. Emily handed the phone back to Torres. Keep her on the line. If she needs the administrator, hand it to him. She looked at Anita. Call Regional Blood Services. Not a request. Tell them it's a mass casualty event and we need emergency O-negative transport. Use that exact language. Then pull every unit of AB plasma we have and get it to the trauma bay. We've got maybe 6 units of plasma. Get them. She was moving before Anita finished confirming, heading toward the ambulance bay where the first ground transports were already pulling up. She could hear Voss behind her saying something, the controlled executive anger of a man whose instrument panel was suddenly filled with warnings he didn't know how to read, but she didn't stop and nobody stopped her because the automatic doors slid open and the first gurney came through and everything else became secondary. The soldier on the gurney was maybe 23 years old. He had a field dressing on his left thigh that was soaked through and a second dressing on his left forearm that was newer, put on by someone who knew what they were doing. His color was bad, that particular gray-yellow that meant he'd lost significant volume. The EMS crew with him was doing compression with one hand and pushing the gurney with the other and talking fast. Blunt trauma to the thorax, suspected internal bleeding, BP was 74/40 when we loaded him, 2 IVs running wide open. He was conscious 10 minutes ago. Emily was already at the head of the gurney. What's his name? Sergeant Dale Pruitt, 24 years old. Dale. She put her hand on his shoulder, kept her voice level and direct. I'm Emily. You're at the hospital. You're going to get worked on right now. Can you tell me where it hurts most? His eyes found her. They were glassy but tracking. My chest, he said. The words cost him something. On a scale of 1 to 10. 8. He tried to take a full breath and couldn't. Maybe 9. She looked at the EMS tech. Breath sounds? Decreased on the left. Get him to trauma 1. She turned. Where is Dr. Fulton? Right here. He'd come up behind her, already gloved, a penlight in his chest pocket. Suspected hemothorax left side. BP's in the basement. He needs a chest tube and probably a surgeon. She met Fulton's eyes. How long to clear the OR? I'm told 15 minutes. Make it 10. And we need a surgeon who's good with thoracic trauma. Who do we have? Fulton hesitated for exactly the wrong amount of time. Fulton. Dr. Brecht is on elective. He's general surgery. He can do thoracic in a crisis, but it's not his primary. Get him out of the OR and brief him. Pruitt goes up as soon as the room is clear. She was already moving to the next gurney that was coming through the doors. Who else is incoming ground level? The next 4 minutes were the kind that she'd learned to live inside during her second deployment. The ones where time didn't exactly slow down, but became extremely dense, every second containing more information than a normal second should. 2 more soldiers came through ground transport, one with a crush injury to the arm that needed ortho consultation, and one with a head laceration and altered consciousness that was worrying in a way she couldn't fully assess in the bay without imaging. She went patient to patient, not touching much, just looking and listening and asking the specific questions that told her what she needed to know, pulling triage assessments in 30 seconds that it would take most nurses 3 minutes to complete, and she was aware somewhere behind all of it that Voss was still in the building, still watching, and that several of the nursing staff who had watched her walk out with her badge this morning were now watching her work in a way that was different from the normal attention of colleagues. Then the helicopters landed. She heard them before she could see them, the concrete under her feet transmitting the vibration just slightly before the sound through the ambulance bay wall, and then the doors opened again, and it was different. The casualties coming off the helicopters were worse. The ground transports had been the ones stable enough to move by road. These were the ones who hadn't been. A military medic, young, female, still in her tactical vest with the Velcro tabs undone, came through ahead of the first helicopter casualty and found Emily without being directed to her, which meant someone had communicated what she looked like. Sergeant First Class Yolanda Reeves, she said, extending her hand while moving. I was on scene. I need to brief you. Brief me while we walk. Emily was already moving toward the incoming. 7 critical off the helicopters. 2 are penetrating trauma. Debris from the bridge structure. 3 are crush injuries from vehicle rollover. 1 is a suspected spinal injury with intact sensation, still assessing. 1 is... Reeves paused, a fraction of a second, something moving behind her eyes. 1 is Commander Terrence Wall. He was the convoy commander. His injuries are significant. He's been asking about his people since we loaded him. Emily looked at her. How bad? Both legs. Internal. He's talking, but he's compensating hard. Where is he? Last bird, 2 minutes. Emily turned and found Anita right behind her. Anita had been following her without being asked, pulling information from the board and feeding it forward. It was exactly the right instinct. Where are we on ORs? Emily asked. One cleared. Pruitt is being prepped. Second OR, Brecht is wrapping the elective. He says 5 more minutes. We're going to need that room the moment he's done. And I need someone to call whatever hospital has the nearest neurosurgeon and find out how fast they can get here for a potential spinal case. On it. The last helicopter was a military medical evac, and it put down in the side lot where Crestview had a rooftop pad that nobody had used for a real emergency in 7 months. She took the stairs at a pace that was just below running, came out through the rooftop access door into the cold mountain air and the rotor wash, and got her first look at Commander Terrence Wall. He was 61 years old, she'd find out later. He looked younger when he was awake and in command of himself, which he was, even strapped to the evac board with his legs in field splints and an oxygen mask pushed up on his forehead because he'd refused to keep it on. He had the build of someone who'd spent decades in physical service, not big, but dense, economical, like the weight had been compressed. His face was pale and tight with controlled pain. He saw her come through the door and his eyes went to her face with the particular directness of someone who had been waiting. "Are you Carter?" he said. "I am." "Colonel Maris told me you'd be here." He tried to shift on the board and the medic with him, a different one, older, put a hand on his chest without looking up from the IV line he was managing. Wall didn't fight it. "My people, what's the count?" 11 critical on arrival, being worked on. 19 serious, assessed, and being monitored. 4 walking wounded already treated. She crouched down to be level with him. "I need to tell you that your hospital hasn't dealt with a casualty load like this before. We're managing it, but I need you to know what you're walking into." He studied her. "Are my people going to make it?" "Some of them will need surgery I can't fully predict the outcome of. Pruitt's going in first. He has a hemothorax. We have a surgeon for him. I'm more worried about 3 of the crush injuries and 1 of the spinal assessments. I won't give you numbers that aren't honest." Something in his face settled, like someone receiving actual information after a long stretch of guesses. "Maris said you ran trauma teams in Kandahar. And 2 other places?" "She also said Crestview fired you this morning." "They did." He didn't look particularly surprised. "Politics." "Something like that." "Well," he closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "Let's focus on not losing anybody today." She stood. "Get him inside into Trauma 2, she told the medic. "I'll be right behind you." She stood on the roof for 3 more seconds after they'd gone through the door, looking out at the mountains that surrounded Redstone on 3 sides, at the city below that was just starting to understand that something significant was happening at the hospital on its north end. Then she went back inside. The next 2 hours were the kind of work she understood at a cellular level, not because it was easy, but because she had done it in conditions that were orders of magnitude worse, and the muscle memory, the cognitive pathways, the specific way her brain organized priority and resource under pressure, all of it came back like a language she'd never actually forgotten. She moved between trauma bays and the hallway outside the ORs and the nurses' station, constantly updating the board in her head even when she wasn't near the physical one, tracking every patient by name and status and the next decision point each one represented. Pruitt went into surgery at 8:47. Fulton managed the first 2 crush injuries alongside Reeves, whose battlefield trauma experience was better than any of the ER nurses on shift. Emily caught a dosing error on a morphine order. The attending had written it for a patient weight that didn't account for the field medication the military medics had already administered, and flagged it before it was administered, doing it quietly, directly to Fulton, without making it a thing. He corrected it without comment. That was the right response. Wall was more complicated than his field presentation had suggested. His legs were fractured, right femur, left tib fib. But the internal concern was a suspected splenic laceration that the ultrasound confirmed at 9:04. He went to surgery behind Pruitt, and before he went, he asked Emily to stand where he could see her, Not for comfort, she understood, but because he was tracking his own care environment the way commanders did, cataloging who was responsible for what. "You've done this before," he said. Not a question. "Too many times." "You like it?" She thought about it honestly. "I like when people don't die," she said. "That part I like." He almost smiled. Then the anesthesiologist took over and she stepped back and let the OR team do their work. By 10:30, the acute phase had shifted. 2 patients were in surgery, 3 were in imaging, 4 had been moved to monitored beds in the ICU that had been hurriedly expanded by pulling staff from elective recovery. The walking wounded had been treated and collected in a waiting area where 2 of them were playing cards with a dog-eared deck that someone had produced from somewhere. The ER floor had achieved the particular state that Emily recognized as controlled chaos. Still loud, still demanding, but no longer running purely on adrenaline. Now running on systems and procedure and the accumulated decisions of the last 2 hours beginning to hold. She was at the station updating triage notes when Sandra Reeve appeared at her elbow. Sandra had been in the building the whole time. Emily had caught glimpses of her in the periphery, managing logistics, directing the expanded ICU setup, doing the supervisory work that needed doing without getting in the way of the clinical work. It was competent. Emily had never thought Sandra was incompetent. She thought Sandra was someone who had learned to survive in an institution run by Harlan Voss, which required a very specific kind of accommodation. "The board is asking for an update," Sandra said. She was looking at the chart in Emily's hands, not at Emily's face. "Fulton can give them a clinical update." "They're asking for you specifically." Emily set down the pen. "Who is?" "Board Chair, Meredith Halcott. She came in 40 minutes ago." Sandra paused. "She's been talking to Colonel Maris." Emily looked at her. Sandra was doing the thing she always did when she was uncomfortable, a slight tightening at the corners of her mouth, like she was holding something back through force of muscle. "Where's Voss?" Emily asked. "In his office." Sandra finally looked at her. "He's been there since the first helicopters landed." That was its own kind of information. Emily filed it. She found Meredith Halcott in the small conference room off the main corridor. The same one, she noted, where she'd been fired 4.5 hours ago. Halcott was 70, a former physician who'd transitioned to hospital administration a decade back, the kind of board chair who actually read the documents in front of her, rather than delegating comprehension to staff. She had silver hair cut practically, and the manner of someone who had sat through a large number of conversations she could have summarized in a quarter of the time. She looked up when Emily came in. "Ms. Carter?" She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down." "I'd rather stand if it's the same to you. I've got patients to get back to." Halcott accepted that without comment. "Colonel Maris briefed me on the authority under which you've been operating this morning. I want to make clear that from the hospital's perspective, we're grateful for your involvement in today's emergency." A pause. "I also want to make clear that I'm aware that your involvement happened because we were dramatically underprepared and because you were the most qualified person available." Emily said nothing. "I've been told by Colonel Maris," Halcott continued carefully, "that you have a service record that is significantly more substantial than what appears in your personnel file here." She opened a folder. "Would you like to tell me why that is?" "I kept my military background private. It wasn't relevant to my nursing position." Colonel Maris would disagree with that characterization. Halcott looked at the folder. She used the phrase material misrepresentation by omission when describing your personnel file, though she directed that characterization at our HR department, not at you. She set down the folder. "What I want to understand, Ms. Carter, is why someone with your background took a floor nursing position at a regional hospital in Redstone." Emily looked at the conference table, at the scratch near the edge that she hadn't noticed when she was sitting on the other side of it this morning. "I was done," she said simply, "with the operational environment. I wanted to do the work without the context." Halcott studied her. "And were you?" "Done?" "Not quite, apparently." Halcott was quiet for a moment. Outside the room, the hospital noise continued. The intercoms, the rolling wheels, the voices at different distances carrying different levels of urgency. "I want to discuss your termination this morning," she said. "I want to see the documentation that supported it." "So do I." Halcott's voice had gone to something flat and very precise. Because what I've been told so far does not align with what should be in that file, and I want to understand why. Emily felt something shift inside her chest. Not relief. It was too early for relief, and she'd learned the hard way not to mistake preliminary justice for actual justice. But something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The sensation of being seen accurately after a long period of being seen wrong. Then I'll tell you exactly what happened on Sunday evening, she said, and every incident before it that I documented in my own records, starting with the first medication error I flagged and what happened after I filed that report. She talked for 12 minutes. She was precise. She didn't editorialize, didn't characterize, just sequenced events with timestamps and cross-references and the specific names of the patients involved. Halcott listened without interrupting, making notes in a small notebook with a mechanical pencil, her face giving almost nothing away except the increased speed of the notation when Emily reached the Sunday incident and the fact of the deleted backup call. When Emily finished, Halcott looked at her notes for a moment. "The backup call log," she said. "You're certain you made it?" "Yes." "And you believe it was deleted?" "I believe the outcome is consistent with deletion. I can't tell you by whom." Halcott closed the notebook. "I'm going to need to speak with IT and with compliance." She stood. "In the meantime, I'd like you to continue in your current capacity as military consultant for as long as Colonel Mares requires it." A pause. "And I want to say, personally, that the decision made this morning was made without my knowledge or authorization. I don't know yet the full extent of what occurred, but I intend to." Emily looked at her. "Mr. Voss has been administrator here for 11 years. "I'm aware of that. There are other nurses, other staff. If what happened to me is a pattern, then the pattern will be examined." Halcott said it in a way that settled things. Not a promise made lightly, not reassurance for its own sake, just a statement of intent from someone who meant it. Emily nodded, went back to the floor. The afternoon settled into the particular rhythm of post-acute management. The decisions that came after the immediate crisis was contained, and the longer-term questions began surfacing. Pruitt came out of surgery at 12:14. The surgeon, Brecht, found Emily in the hallway and briefed her directly, which he hadn't done with any of the other nursing staff, and she noted that without comment. The hemothorax had been more extensive than the initial ultrasound suggested. The chest tube had already been draining when they opened him, and Brecht had needed to repair a laceration along the lower lobe that was actively bleeding. But he was stable. He was going to be all right. She went to recovery and stood at the end of his bed for a moment. He was out, still deep in the anesthesia. He had a tattoo on his right forearm, a geometric pattern that she recognized as a Ranger tab variation. Young, 24. She thought about him asking for his oxygen mask to be adjusted in the ambulance bay because it was pulling at his ear, and finding it remarkable that he'd had the presence of mind to notice that detail. She wrote a note in his chart. Then she left. Wall's surgery took longer. He had the splenectomy at 1:30 and was in recovery by 3:45. And when he came around enough to be coherent, he asked the recovery nurse 3 questions in order: what time it was, where Pruitt was, and where Carter was. The recovery nurse relayed the last question to the floor, and Emily appeared in the doorway of recovery at 4:02. Wall looked at her. His color was better. The surgery had resolved the internal bleed that had been pulling the life out of him, and his face had some warmth back in it. "Pruitt?" he said. "Out of surgery, stable. He's going to need PT on the chest, but he's going to recover fully." He exhaled. Not dramatically, just the release of something he'd been holding. "My XO, he said. "Aldridge. Where is he?" "Captain Aldridge is in a monitored bed in the ICU. Crush injuries to the pelvis and right hip. He's had imaging and he's on pain management. The orthopedic consult is happening in the next hour." She met his eyes. "He's asking about you." Wall made a sound that was between a laugh and something else. "Tell him I'm fine. Don't tell him I cried when I came out of anesthesia." "You cried when you came out of anesthesia?" "I don't know. I was unconscious. I'm preemptively managing the narrative." He looked at her. "Maris called me again, 15 minutes ago." "I know. She updated me too." Something in his expression shifted. Then you know what they found. She did. That was the part she'd been sitting with for the last 40 minutes, since Maris had called her directly with the preliminary information from the military auditors who had arrived at the hospital at 1:15 p.m. with identification and very specific questions. She'd known something was wrong. She'd known it in the way you know things when you have spent enough time in environments where institutional cover-up is a survival strategy. You feel the shape of it before you can prove it. She'd known that the deleted call log was not a technical error. She'd known that the complaint from Ardell's wife had been shaped by someone, guided along certain lines, encouraged in a direction it might not have gone on its own. What she hadn't known was how long it had been going on. The military auditors had come because Wall's convoy had been carrying classified medical supply equipment that had a documented chain of custody, and that chain had a gap. The gap pointed to Crestview Medical Center, a billing discrepancy in a contract between the hospital and a military medical supply vendor, a contract that sat under Harlan Voss's administrative authority and had for the past 4 years. It was the kind of discrepancy that looked like a rounding error until you pulled the secondary documentation, at which point it looked like something else entirely. "They're still going through the records," she said carefully. She wasn't going to speculate beyond what she knew. Maris said the auditors will be interviewing staff tomorrow. Wall looked at the ceiling. 4 years, he said. That's preliminary. Still. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. When he looked at her again, his expression had the particular quality of exhausted pragmatism that she associated with experienced military officers dealing with institutional failure. Not shocked, because they'd seen enough of the world to understand that institutions failed, but genuinely tired by it. "What are you going to do?" he said. "Keep working. I've got 11 patients who need management through the night." "I mean, after." She considered the question. "I don't know yet." "Maris wants to talk to you about a consulting role, civilian contract. She mentioned it." "She mentioned it to me too. And?" "And I said I don't know yet." She looked at him. "Right now I need to check on the spinal assessment in bed 4 before the neurosurgeon gets here. So if you're stable and your pain is managed, go," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She was almost at the door when he said her name. She turned. "What they did to you this morning," he said. "Firing you. The way they did it." He paused, choosing words carefully. The way people did when they felt something strongly and didn't want the words to embarrass them. "That's not—" He stopped, started again. "You didn't deserve that." She stood in the doorway for a second. "No," she said, "I didn't." Then she went back to the floor. It was 5:18 p.m. when Harlan Voss walked out of his office. She was at the nurse's station when she saw him, and she registered his appearance in the same way she registered everything that afternoon. Quickly, filed, assessed for priority. He was wearing his coat, which meant he was intending to leave. His briefcase was in his hand. He was walking with the deliberate regularity of someone performing normalcy under observation. He came around the corner toward the main lobby. He hadn't looked at her yet, though she was directly in his line of sight, and she understood that this was intentional, the way not looking at something is always intentional. He was 15 feet from the main lobby doors when Colonel Maris walked through them. Maris was 53, trim in her uniform, with the kind of posture that didn't require effort because it had long since become the default. She had 2 people with her. Civilian clothes, lanyards, the specific purposeful neutrality of federal investigators. Behind them, 2 uniformed MPs held the lobby doors. Maris saw Voss. Stopped. Voss stopped. The lobby was not quiet. It had the ambient noise of a hospital in a busy afternoon, the intercoms and the movement and the families in the waiting area. But in the space between Maris and Voss, there was a particular silence that Emily could feel from 30 feet away. "Mr. Voss," Maris said. Her voice carried exactly as far as it needed to. "I'm Colonel Judith Maris. These gentlemen are with the Federal Contracting Fraud Division and the Inspector General's office. We have some questions about your hospital's contract management practices over the past 4 years. We'd appreciate your cooperation." Voss looked at the men beside her, at their lanyards, at the briefcase in his own hand, which he seemed to become aware of holding as if for the first time. "I was just on my way home," he said. "Of course," Maris said pleasantly. We can have this conversation here or somewhere else. That's entirely your choice. The lobby had gone quiet in the graduated way that public spaces go quiet when something is happening. The individual conversations dropping off one by one as attention reoriented, the movement slowing, the families in the waiting area turning their heads. Emily watched from the nurse's station. She was aware of Anita standing beside her, of Torres at the desk, of two of the staff nurses who had watched her lose her badge that morning, now watching Voss stand in the lobby with investigators on either side of him. He turned his head, finally, and he looked at her. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took her to understand that he knew. Not just that this was happening, but why it was happening, and what it meant, and how quickly the next several hours were going to move. She could see it in his face, that specific knowledge. She looked away first, not because she was intimidated, because she had charts to finish. Behind her, she heard Voss say something to Maris in a tone that was meant to project control. She didn't hear what it was. She went back to the chart in front of her and picked up the pen. Anita was quiet for a moment, then very quietly. Emily. I know. 4 years. Probably more. Anita made a sound that was not quite a word. All those nurses She stopped. I know, Emily said again. She finished the chart, started the next one. Around her, the hospital kept moving, because hospitals always kept moving, because the patients in the beds didn't stop needing things, because the administrator was being escorted toward a conference room by federal investigators, because Sergeant Pruitt in recovery needed his vitals checked at 5:30, and Commander Wall's surgical drain needed to be measured at 6 o'clock, and the soldier in bed 4 was still waiting on a neurosurgeon who was 40 minutes out on the highway. She kept working. It was 6:47, and she was reading a new imaging report when Maris appeared at the nurse's station. Ms. Carter. Her voice was measured, but something had shifted in it from the phone calls earlier in the day. I need you to come with me for a moment. Emily set down the report, looked at Maris's face. What happened? The auditors have been going through Mr. Voss's administrative files. Maris paused. They found something that directly concerns you. Emily waited. There are emails, Maris said, between Voss and someone on the nursing supervision staff, specifically regarding the Sunday incident with Mr. Ardell. The emails discuss, in explicit terms, coordinating the complaint against you and ensuring the documentation in the system was consistent with that complaint. The lobby was quiet around them. Torres was pretending to look at his screen. He was not looking at his screen. Emily set down the pen. How many names? She said. At least 3 at the supervisory level, possibly more. Maris looked at her steadily. There is also email correspondence discussing your military background. Someone had looked into your service record and communicated that information to Voss, and there is a subsequent discussion about whether your background made you she paused, choosing the precise word, manageable. The words sat in the air between them. Emily looked at the board, at the 11 names on it with their status indicators and their timers, and the cascading decisions that each one required, at the work that still needed doing. They knew, she said. Not a question. It appears so. Yes. She thought about the 2 years, the safety reports that went nowhere, the quiet cooling of temperature, the way Voss had looked at her in that conference room this morning with the expression of someone executing a plan rather than making a decision. She thought about how the email she was being described would read. She didn't need to see it. She could construct it. The nursing board needs to be notified, she said. If staff members participated in coordinating a false complaint, that's a licensing issue, not just an employment issue. The IG's office is already in contact with the state licensing board. And the patient, Ardell, his wife filed a complaint based on information she was given. She should know what she was given wasn't accurate. That will be handled. Emily was quiet for a moment. Okay. Maris looked at her. Okay? I mean, she exhaled, pressed 2 fingers briefly to her forehead. I mean, I understand what you're telling me, and I'll deal with the implications of it when I have time to deal with them. She looked at the board. Right now, I need to know if the neurosurgeon is 20 minutes out or 40, because Bed 4's presentation has me concerned, and I want to be at that bedside when the consult happens. Maris was quiet for a second, Then, I don't know. Can you find out? Maris almost smiled. It was very small. I'll make a call. She left. Emily went back to the board. The neurosurgeon, a Dr. Petra Vance driving in from Fallbrook, was 32 minutes out when Emily's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown Crestview number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't open it. She was mid-assessment on the bed 4 patient, a Corporal Marcus Tilton who was 26 and terrified, and had been trying to hide the terror behind a veneer of military composure that kept slipping when he thought no one was looking. She'd been talking him through the imaging results and what the neurosurgeon was going to assess, keeping her voice steady and specific, giving him the information he needed to replace the speculation that was feeding his fear. She finished the explanation, checked his vitals, made the note, stepped out, opened the message. It was from an internal extension she didn't recognize, and it read, "This is HR. Before the auditors talk to you tomorrow, Voss knows you kept external records. He's told them your personal logs are fabricated. You need to get ahead of this tonight." She stared at it. Then she looked up, down the corridor, at the nurses' station where Torres was on the phone, at the ER entrance where 2 military MPs had been positioned since Maris arrived. The message could be exactly what it appeared to be, a well-meaning warning from someone in HR. It could also be something else, someone trying to pressure her into a particular action before tomorrow, someone trying to establish a narrative. She forwarded it to Maris without responding to it. Then she pocketed the phone and went back to Tilton's room, because he had asked her to be there when the neurosurgeon arrived and she was going to be there, and everything else was going to have to wait. The neurosurgeon arrived at 7:19. Dr. Vance was efficient and direct, the kind of specialist who gave families information in complete sentences and didn't hedge to protect herself from follow-up questions. Emily stood at the door during the consult, present without intruding, listening to Vance walk through the imaging and the assessment and what it meant for Tilton's recovery trajectory. The spinal injury was real but incomplete. The cord was intact. With the right intervention and the right rehabilitation, there was a strong probability of full recovery. Tilton's composure finally cracked, and he let it, and Emily stepped out of the room to give him privacy. She was in the hallway, back against the wall, when Maris found her. "I got your forward," Maris said. "We traced the extension. It was from a phone in the administrative suite." A pause. "Voss is still in the building. He's been cooperating with the interview for the last hour." "So it was him, or someone with access to his office and his knowledge of your records. Either way," Maris stopped. "Either way, we have him on obstruction now, in addition to the contract issues." Emily looked at the ceiling of the corridor, at the fluorescent light directly above her that had a very faint flicker she'd reported to maintenance 6 weeks ago, and that had not been fixed. "There's more," Maris said. Emily looked at her. "The auditors went through the secondary financial records this afternoon, the billing discrepancy I mentioned, the one that connects to the military supply contract." She paused. "It's not isolated. There are at least 3 other vendor contracts with similar structures over a 4-year period. We're talking about a systematic diversion of funds, not a single error." Another pause, longer. "The preliminary figure is substantial." Emily said nothing. "There are names beyond Voss in the documentation," Maris said. "I can't tell you who yet, but the scope of this is larger than we initially assessed." Down the corridor, the sound of Tilton's room, his voice, talking to the neurosurgeon, the sound of someone who had just been given good news trying to figure out what to do with it. "What happens tomorrow?" Emily said. "The auditors resume at 800. Federal investigators will be here with formal warrants. The board chair has been fully briefed." Maris looked at her. "You'll be asked to provide your personal records formally. I need you to know that the message you received about those records, I know what it was. Your records are contemporaneous documentation, timestamps that predate any of this morning's events by 2 years. That's significant." "I know." Maris was quiet for a moment. "How are you holding up?" Emily looked at her. It was a straightforward question from someone who was not, by disposition or professional habit, a person who asked straightforward questions unless she meant them. "I'm fine," Emily said. And then, because it was Maris, and because Maris would know the difference, "I'm angry, but I'm managing it." "Good," Maris nodded. Get some sleep tonight if you can. Tomorrow is going to be... The call light above Trauma Bay 1 lit up simultaneously with the alarm from Pruitt's recovery monitor, and a nurse's voice came over the intercom with the controlled, urgent tone of someone reporting a complication. Pruitt, Sergeant Pruitt, recovery, possible bleeding at the surgical site. Emily was already moving. She hit the recovery ward doors at a run and didn't slow down. Pruitt was awake, which was the first thing she registered. Awake and distressed, his hand pressed to his left side where the surgical dressing had soaked through in a dark, spreading circle that was moving faster than a post-op bleed should move. The recovery nurse, a woman named Galvez, who was competent and currently working very hard to stay that way, had already called the alarm and was applying direct pressure with both hands. "How long?" Emily said, pulling gloves from the box on the wall. "I noticed the saturation drop 4 minutes ago. Dressing was dry when I checked at 6:50. 4 minutes. That was either good or very bad, depending on the source." Emily looked at the monitor. Sat 91 and dropping, heart rate 118, BP starting to slide. "Pruitt," she put her hand on his shoulder. "Stay with me. I need you to tell me if the pain is sharp or pressure." "Pressure," he said through his teeth. "Inside, like something's..." He stopped. His jaw was tight. "Okay. Don't talk." She looked at Galvez. "Get Brecht back in, right now, and I need a portable ultrasound in here in 60 seconds. Galvez got on the radio without taking her hands off the dressing. Emily was already running her hands along Pruitt's left flank, feeling for what the monitor couldn't tell her, and what she felt was wrong. The rigidity of the abdomen on the left side had changed since his pre-op assessment, a subtle but real hardening that, combined with the saturation drop and the rate of bleed-through on the dressing, gave her a picture she didn't like. Post-operative hemorrhage, not at the chest tube site, somewhere deeper. The ultrasound came in on a cart pushed by a tech who'd been pulled from imaging, and Emily had the probe on Pruitt's abdomen inside 90 seconds. She wasn't a radiologist. She wasn't supposed to be running bedside ultrasound on a post-surgical patient at... She checked the clock. 7:31 p.m. on a day that had started with her being walked out of the building. But she knew what she was looking at, because she had learned to read ultrasound in a combat support hospital in conditions that made this look serene, and what she saw on the screen was free fluid in the left upper quadrant, more than there should be, collecting in a space that the surgery should have closed. Brecht arrived 4 minutes after the call, still in his street clothes. He'd been in the physician lounge, and he took one look at the screen and said a word that Emily chose not to register, then looked at her. "You red?" "Rebleed. Left upper quadrant. I think you've got a suture or a clip that's let go." His pressure was fine in recovery. Pressures lie when someone's compensating. He's young and fit, and he held it together until he couldn't anymore. She met Brecht's eyes. "He needs to go back in." Brecht was already moving to the phone. "Get OR2 back up," he said to Galvez. "Now. And call anesthesia." Pruitt grabbed Emily's wrist. She looked down at him. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone whose pressure was sitting at 84/52. "Am I..." He stopped. Tried again. "Am I going to..." "You're going back to surgery," she said. "Dr. Brecht is going to fix the bleed. Your vitals are low, but they're holding." She held his gaze. "You've been through worse than this, and you know it." He looked at her for a long second. Then he let go of her wrist. "Okay," he said. His voice was steadier than it had any right to be. She stayed with him until the OR team arrived and took over, then stepped back and let them move, watching the gurney roll out and the doors swing shut and feeling the particular weight of a situation that was no longer in her hands. She had done what could be done. Now it was Brecht's. She stood in the empty recovery bay for exactly 4 seconds. Then her radio, Maris had given her a hospital radio at 2 p.m., and she'd clipped it to her hip without thinking about the symbolism of it, crackled with Anita's voice. "Emily, East Corridor. You need to come to the East Corridor right now." "What is it?" "It's Voss." She was moving before Anita finished the sentence. The East Corridor was the administrative wing. Offices, conference rooms, the HR suite, the long carpeted hallway that connected the clinical building to the business side of the hospital. It was not a place where clinical events happened. It was not a place she'd expected to be running toward at 7:36 p.m. on this particular Tuesday. She turned the corner and stopped. Harlan Voss was on the floor. He was conscious. She established that in the first second because his eyes were open and tracking, and he was speaking in fragments to the investigator kneeling beside him, a man named Greer, who she'd been introduced to briefly that afternoon. Two other people were standing back, one of them on a phone, one of them with his hand out in the universal gesture of "everyone give us space." She pushed through. "What happened?" She was already crouching, 2 fingers to his carotid, her eyes on his face. "He just went down," Greer said, mid-sentence. "I don't know if did he lose consciousness?" For maybe 10 seconds. His pulse was rapid and irregular. His color was off. Not the gray-yellow of blood loss, but the particular pallor of a cardiac event. That specific look she'd seen enough times to trust over any monitor. He was diaphoretic, shirt damp at the collar, and his left hand was pressed to his sternum in the gesture that patients always described later as, "I thought I had indigestion." "Mr. Voss?" She put her face in his line of sight. "Can you hear me?" "Yes." His voice was thin. "I need you to tell me if you have chest pain." "It's pressure. Left side. I thought it was..." "How long?" 20 minutes, maybe longer." He looked at her, and in his face she saw something that she had not seen in it before. The specific fear of a man who understood, suddenly and concretely, that his body was operating outside his control. I didn't want to say anything while they were..." "It doesn't matter." She was already reaching for the radio. "I need a crash cart to the East Corridor, and I need a cardiology consult, and someone call down to the ER and tell them we have a possible STEMI in the administrative wing." She got acknowledgement from the desk. Voss looked up at her. She was the one person in the corridor who was doing something useful, so that was where his eyes went. Not by choice, she thought, but by necessity. "Carter," he said. "Don't talk. Save your energy." Carter. His hand moved toward her arm and didn't quite reach it. I know you have no reason to..." "I said don't talk." She checked his pulse again, still irregular, rate up. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this because it's what I do." And that was true. She examined it as she said it and found it accurate, the way facts sometimes were, simple and inconvenient and real. She did not feel warmth toward him. She felt the specific, focused attention of a clinician with a patient who needed intervention, and whatever she felt beyond that she had boxed and set aside for later in the way she'd learned to box things and set them aside. The crash cart came. The ER team arrived 40 seconds behind it. She stepped back and let them work, giving the handoff, symptoms onset, vitals, the syncope episode, her suspected diagnosis, in the 15-second compressed briefing format she'd learned to use when the team coming in needed information fast and clean. The ER physician, a woman she hadn't worked with before, absorbed it and took over without the kind of territorial hesitation that sometimes happened, and Emily stepped all the way back against the corridor wall and watched. Greer was beside her. "Is he going to make it?" he said quietly. "Depends on what this is and how fast they move." "Does it matter to you?" She looked at him. He was asking genuinely, not provocatively, trying to understand something. "For the purpose of what I'm doing right now," she said. "Yes. After that..." She paused. "Ask me in a week." They got Voss onto a gurney and moved him toward the elevator and the cardiac unit 3 floors up, and the corridor emptied out except for Greer and 2 other investigators, and Emily standing against the wall. Then Maris appeared at the far end of the corridor, walking fast, phone in hand. Her expression was different from anything Emily had seen on it all day. Emily pushed off the wall. Maris reached her and stopped. She looked once at Greer, then back at Emily. The look she gave Greer was the kind that moved people out of earshot without requiring words, and he took 3 steps back. "I just got off the phone with the IG's lead auditor," Maris said. She kept her voice low, not from uncertainty, but from precision. "They found a second file set in Voss's administrative system, a partition that was encrypted and separate from the main records." Emily waited. "Emily?" Maris's voice was very steady. "The file set contains personnel records, Modified records. Not just for you, for 14 other staff members over a 6-year period. She paused. 3 of those people are no longer employed anywhere in healthcare. 2 filed professional complaints that were dismissed. 1 left the state. She stopped. The records were altered to support terminations, disciplinary actions, and formal complaints in every case. The corridor was very quiet. "There's something else," Maris said. Emily looked at her. "One of the files contains a recording," Maris said, "audio, from the conference room on the east corridor." A pause. "Date stamp is this morning, 7:02 a.m. The conference room on the east corridor, the one with the frosted glass door, the one they called the fishbowl, the room where she'd been fired." Emily felt something cold move through her. Not fear, something more like the sensation of a structure you'd been standing on revealing itself to be built on something entirely different than you'd assumed. "He recorded the termination meeting," she said. "He recorded everything in that room," Maris said, "for at least 3 years." Emily stood very still. "We don't know yet what's on the other recordings," Maris said, "but the one from this morning—" She stopped. "Emily, his own recording contradicts every justification he gave for firing you. The documentation he cited doesn't match what he said in that room. He made statements this morning, on his own recording, that amount to admission of what he knew and when." Down the corridor, the elevator dinged. Someone's shoes on the linoleum. The ambient noise of the hospital doing what hospitals always did, continuing regardless. Emily looked at the door of the conference room, at the frosted glass panel, at the shapes moving distantly through it. "How long before the auditors can process all of it?" she said. "They're working through the night." Maris looked at her. "By morning, we'll have a much clearer picture of the full extent." She paused. "Emily, this is bigger than one administrator and one hospital. The financial trail connects to a vendor network that operates across 4 regional medical centers. The IG's office has been looking for a thread into this for 2 years. She met her eyes directly. "You're the thread?" The weight of that sat between them. Emily thought about the incident account she'd been drafting at her kitchen table this morning. The careful timestamps. The 2 years of documentation she'd kept in the second bedroom because she'd learned a long time ago, in places where institutional failure had life and death consequences, that the only record you could fully trust was the one you controlled yourself. She thought about 14 other names in a partition file. 3 of them no longer in healthcare. 2 dismissed complaints. 1 person who had left the state rather than keep fighting. Her radio crackled. Anita's voice, tight and urgent. "Emily, or 2, Brecht needs you. Pruitt's pressure is dropping on the table, and Brecht is asking if you can. He's asking for you specifically." She was already moving. "I'll be there in 2 minutes," she said into the radio. Then to Maris. "We finish this conversation when I'm done." "Go," Maris said. She ran. She was halfway to the OR when her phone buzzed. A different number this time, one she recognized. Dennis Rourke. She picked up without stopping. "Tell me you're still in the building," he said. "I'm still in the building." "Good. I'm in the parking lot." And Emily, his voice had something in it she hadn't heard from Rourke in the entire time she'd known him. Something close to urgency without the operational covering it. "I need you to know that before I came here tonight, I made some calls about your service record, about the documentation of your deployments." A pause. "There are people who want to speak publicly, people who served with you, officers, medics, people who know exactly what you did and where, and under what conditions." Another pause. "I couldn't stop them even if I wanted to, and I don't want to." She pushed through the OR prep doors. "Dennis," she said, "I have to go." "I know, I'll be here." She ended the call, gloved up in 15 seconds, and pushed through the inner doors where Brecht was waiting with an expression that told her the next 30 minutes were going to decide whether Dale Pruitt, 24 years old, Ranger Tab tattoo, kept asking about his oxygen mask because it pulled on his ear, was going to walk out of Crestview Medical Center. The OR was cold the way ORs always were, a deliberate cold that kept the surgeon sharp and the bacteria suppressed, and Emily felt it through her scrub top as she came through the inner doors and read the room in the first 3 seconds. Pruitt was on the table, chest open at the left lateral thoracotomy site that Brecht had already extended. The anesthesiologist, a man named Holloway, who Emily had worked alongside twice during the afternoon's initial surge, had his eyes on the monitors and his jaw set in the particular way of someone managing a situation that was technically within his control, but only just. 2 scrub techs. 1 circulating nurse. Brecht with both hands inside the chest cavity, and the expression of a general surgeon who had found something a general surgeon does not particularly want to find. "What do you have?" Emily said, moving to the field. "Intercostal vessel," Brecht said. "I thought I had it controlled intraoperatively. I didn't." He didn't look up. His pressure tanked at 758. He's been at 68/40 for the last 4 minutes. I need another set of hands that knows what they're doing in a tight space, and right now, you're what I have. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to hold retraction on the left lower lobe while I get proximal control. The angle is wrong and I keep losing visibility." He looked up for exactly 1 second. "Can you do that?" She glanced at Holloway. "His sat?" 88, holding. "How much volume has he received?" 2 units packed red cells, 1 FFP, in the last 20 minutes. She looked at the field. She was a nurse. She was not a surgeon. What Brecht was asking her to do existed in a gray zone of emergency provision that she had inhabited before, in a forward surgical unit in a country where the nearest fully qualified thoracic surgeon had been 4 hours away by aircraft, and the soldier on the table had 4 minutes. She knew the gray zone. She'd learned to work in it without flinching and without pretending it wasn't gray. "Show me the angle," she said. Brecht showed her. She gloved up to sterile and took the retractor and held it at the position he indicated, and it was not comfortable. The angle required her to maintain pressure against the natural resistance of tissue in a way that made her forearm shake slightly after 90 seconds. But it was the right position, because the moment she held it, Brecht said, "There," in a voice that was quiet and very focused, and she felt rather than saw the shift in the field as he got the exposure he needed. She didn't watch what he was doing. She watched the monitors. She watched Holloway's hands. She watched Pruitt's face, which was slack under the anesthesia. The face of someone entirely trusting the people in the room, with him in the way that unconscious patients trusted without knowing they were trusting. And she thought, with the strange clarity that high-pressure situations sometimes produced, 24 years old, and he held on long enough. "Got it," Brecht said, 7 minutes after she'd taken the retractor. "Proximal control." He exhaled audibly through his nose. Not a dramatic breath, a functional one, the release of held tension. "Suture." The scrub tech had it before the word finished. Emily maintained retraction for 3 more minutes while he closed the vessel, and then Brecht said she could release, and she did, stepping back, pulling the gloves, her arm aching from the sustained position. She looked at Holloway. "Pressure?" "Coming up, 78/50, 81. He watched the monitor. 86. She looked at Pruitt on the table. "He's going to be all right," Holloway said. It wasn't meant as reassurance. It was clinical information, delivered like information. "I know," she said. Brecht was closing. He didn't look up. "I'm going to need you to stay available tonight," he said. "I don't trust this closure until he's been stable for 4 hours." "I'll be here." She stripped off her gown, dropped it in the bin by the door, and walked back out through the prep area. Her hands were steady. Her head was clear. She was also, she realized, running on approximately 18 hours of accumulated cortisol and 4 hours of sleep from the night before, and her body was beginning to send memos about this that she was choosing not to open. She found Dennis Rourke in the hallway outside the OR suite, sitting in one of the plastic chairs along the wall with his coat still on, a cup of vending machine coffee going cold in his hand. He looked up when she came through the door. "How is he?" "He'll make it." She dropped into the chair beside him. The plastic was hard and she didn't care. "What did you mean on the phone? About people who want to speak publicly?" Rourke set down the coffee. He was 61 years old, white-haired now, the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved out of something practical. "After Maurice briefed me this afternoon about the termination, about what they found in the files, I made some calls." He looked at his hands. I called Warrant Officer Delacroix. You remember Delacroix? She remembered Delacroix. 43 years old, combat medic, the steadiest hands under fire she had ever personally witnessed. And Captain UN from the Coast Rotation, and Major Stefanik, he paused. And 12 other people who served with you, or trained under you, or had their lives saved by a decision you made. He looked at her. They all said yes. Yes to what? To going on record, to speaking to investigators, to the licensing board, to whoever needs to hear it. He picked up the coffee again, put it down without drinking. Emily, you filed 2 formal safety reports at this hospital that went nowhere. You flagged 4 medication errors. You kept 2 years of personal documentation that nobody in this building knows how to explain away. He met her eyes. You didn't just survive what they did to you. You built a case without knowing you were building one. She was quiet for a moment. The OR hallway was hushed around them, the particular after-hours quiet of a hospital at 8:30 p.m., when the daytime machinery had wound down and the night shift hadn't yet hit its stride. There are 14 other names in his files, she said. People he did this to before me. Rourke nodded slowly. Some of them left healthcare. Some of them had complaints dismissed. She looked at the wall across from her. I need to know who they are. The investigators will release that information to you as part of the formal process. I know the formal process takes time. Emily, I'm not going to do anything with it tonight. She stopped. She was more tired than she'd realized, and the tiredness was making her imprecise in a way she didn't like. I want to know their names, she said. I want to know that somebody knows their names. Rourke looked at her for a moment. Maris knows them, he said. She read every file. That was something. She filed it and let it be enough for now. She went back to the floor at 9:05 and spent the next 2 hours doing the work. Vitals checks, medication management, the ongoing monitoring of the 11 military patients who were in various states of post-acute recovery, the documentation that needed to happen so the day shift coming in at 6 a.m. would have accurate information rather than the chaotic residue of an improvised response. She worked methodically, without rushing, covering ground she'd covered before, and covering it again because that was how you kept patients safe. Not through heroics, but through repetition and attention and the refusal to assume that stable meant safe. Around 10:30, Wall's night nurse found her at the station and said the commander was asking if she'd come by before she left for the night. She went. Wall was propped up, looking better than he had any right to given that he'd had abdominal surgery 9 hours ago. He was the kind of person whose baseline was high enough that even significantly diminished he registered as functional. Pruitt, he said, stable. Surgery went long, but Brecht has him closed and his pressure is holding. He exhaled. Thank you. I didn't do the surgery. You know what I mean. She did. Tilton's going to be transferred to a spinal rehab facility in the next 2 days. Dr. Vance gave him good odds for full recovery. Aldridge's... She checked her mental board. Aldridge is going to need a second orthopedic procedure, but not urgently. His pain is managed. Wall was quiet, absorbing the accounting. She'd noticed that about him. He didn't respond to information immediately. He processed it, let it settle, and then spoke from the settled place rather than the reactive one. Maris briefed me, he said finally. The recording, the 14 files. She briefed me too. How are you? The question arrived the same way it had from Maris earlier, without the social performance that usually surrounded it. She gave him the same answer she'd been giving herself all day, minus the part she didn't say out loud. Functioning, she said. Angry. Still managing it? Still managing it. He looked at her. The people he did this to, he said. The ones who left. The ones whose complaints were dismissed. He paused. That's going to require someone to stand up and say it publicly, to not let it become a line item in an IG report that nobody reads. I know. Are you that person? She'd been asking herself that question for the past several hours in the gaps between other, more immediate questions. She hadn't answered it yet. She was not someone who answered questions before she had enough information, and she didn't have enough information yet. Ask me after the investigation is complete, she said. Wall accepted that. Fair. She went back to the monitoring rotation. At 11:15, she checked Pruitt in recovery. Pressure 102/68 and steady, heart rate 88, sat 97. And wrote in his chart and stood at the end of his bed for 2 minutes, watching his chest rise and fall with the particular attention she gave to patients who had scared her. He was going to have a long recovery. The rebleed had cost him, and the repair was more extensive than the initial surgery. He'd be looking at weeks in rehab, possibly months of restricted activity. He was going to be alive to do it. She was back at the station at 11:40 when Maris appeared again, which, at this point in the night, had the quality of something inevitable. Maris moved through the hospital like she was on a clock that ran slightly faster than everyone else's, arriving at intervals that were precise without appearing to be. The auditors finished the second file partition, Maris said, sitting down across from her at the station. Sitting was something Maris did deliberately, Emily had noticed. She used it to signal when she wanted a conversation to be equal rather than briefing format. The financial picture is complete enough to move on. Emily set down the chart. How complete? 4 regional medical centers, 6 years, at least 2 vendor entities that exist primarily as shell structures for fund diversion. Maris looked at the station surface, then back up. The preliminary figure from the auditors is $4.3 million over the period. Emily absorbed that. It was a large number. It was also, she found, less surprising than it might have been this morning. By the time you understood the shape of what someone was willing to do, the personnel files, the modified records, the coordinated false complaints, the recordings, the financial architecture underneath it stopped being surprising and started being explanatory. The money was the reason. The rest was the maintenance of the conditions that allowed the money to continue. Who else? She said. Beyond Voss. At the hospital level, 2 finance supervisors and 1 in the compliance office. At the vendor level, federal investigators are working that end. Maris paused. At the supervisory nursing level, the email chain we identified this afternoon connects to 2 individuals. One of them is Sandra Reeve. Emily was quiet. She thought about Sandra, about the way Sandra had not looked at her during the termination meeting, about Sandra managing the expanded ICU set up this afternoon, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had decided to be useful even inside a situation of her own making, about the 11 years Sandra had spent in this building, navigating Harlan Voss. Was she a co-conspirator, or was she being managed? Emily said. Maris looked at her. It was a specific look, the look of someone recalibrating what they'd expected the question to be. The investigators will determine that. I'm asking what the emails suggest. A pause. The earliest emails are directives from Voss to Reeve. The later ones show Reeve initiating. Maris held her gaze. It changed over time. Emily nodded slowly. She didn't feel forgiveness for Sandra. She felt something more complicated. The recognition that institutions produce the people who serve them, and that Voss's institution had been producing compromised people for 6 years, and that some of those people had made choices they couldn't walk back. She felt that without it softening into excuse. What about Voss himself? She said. Medically. He's stable. Cardiac event. They're calling it a moderate STEMI. He's in the cardiac unit, conscious, and according to the nurse on duty has been asking for his attorney since 9 p.m. A pause. He's under federal detainer. His attorney is aware. The interview will resume when he's medically cleared. And the board? Halcott has been on the phone with legal counsel since this evening. An emergency board session is scheduled for 8 a.m. tomorrow. Maris looked at her. You'll be asked to attend. Emily hadn't planned for that particular item. She added it to the list of things she was going to deal with when she had 4 consecutive hours to think. One more thing, Maris said. She reached into the folder she'd been carrying and slid a single sheet across the station's surface. This came through the IG liaison an hour ago. It's a preliminary summary of your service record as compiled from official military documentation. Emily looked at the sheet. It was dense. Dates and designations and unit assignments and operational theaters, the formal language of military record-keeping that compressed years of experience into bureaucratic notation. But even in that compressed form, it was significant. Not because she didn't know what it said, but because she was reading it as documentation rather than memory, understanding what it looked like to an outside reader. 2 combat deployments, 3 years in forward surgical environments. formal certifications in emergency trauma management, advanced battlefield medicine, and mass casualty triage. Commendation for actions during a mass casualty event in the 3rd deployment rotation that she did not particularly want to revisit the specifics of right now. Training certification as a combat trauma instructor, responsible for certification of 47 military medical personnel. At the bottom, in the notation field, civilian equivalent qualification assessed at senior trauma nursing specialist level, with demonstrated proficiency exceeding standard clinical parameters in mass casualty and tactical emergency environments. She pushed the sheet back. "I know what it says," she said. "I know you do." Maris picked it up. "But tomorrow morning, in an emergency board session, when the board chair reads this document and then looks at Harlan Voss's termination paperwork, the contradiction is going to be impossible to manage." She looked at Emily directly. "I want you to be prepared for what that room is going to feel like." Emily thought about it, about the fishbowl conference room and Voss's face when he took her badge, about the way the lobby guard had held the door without looking at her, about walking to her car through the parking lot in the gray morning air. "I'll be fine," she said. Maris looked at her for a moment that lasted just long enough to be its own kind of communication. Then she stood. "The morning is going to move fast. Get some sleep if you can." She picked up the folder. "I'll see you at 8. She left. Emily sat at the station with the quiet hospital around her, and the monitors cycling their regular readouts and the night shift moving through their rotations with the steady competence of people who knew their work. She sat for a while without picking up a chart, which was unusual for her, but the day had been long enough that she permitted it. At 12:10 a.m., her phone buzzed. Anita, texting from home, where she'd finally been persuaded to go at 10:30. "I heard about Sandra. You okay?" She thought about it. "Yeah," she typed back. "Get some sleep." Emily. "I know, me too. Go to sleep." She pocketed the phone, checked the board one more time, made a note about Pruitt's 2 a.m. vitals check that needed to happen, and wrote her name next to it, because she was going to be here and she was going to do it. Then she found an empty chair in the family waiting area that was, at this hour, empty of families, and she closed her eyes. She did not expect to sleep. She was wrong. She came awake at 2:03 to the sound of her own name, spoken in a tone that brought her fully alert before she was fully conscious. Galvez was standing over her. Recovery nurse, the one who'd caught Pruitt's rebleed. Her face was doing the specific thing that faces did when they were carrying information that they were not looking forward to delivering. "What is it?" Emily said. "Pruitt is fine," Galvez said immediately. "His 2 a.m. numbers are good. This isn't about Pruitt." Emily waited. "An investigator came to the floor 20 minutes ago," Galvez said. She looked uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with being tired. He was asking questions about the administrative records, about documentation from the past 2 years. She paused. "He specifically asked about your personal logs, the ones you've been keeping outside the hospital system. Maris knows about those records. I told her tonight." "I know, that's not—" Galvez stopped, started again. "Emily, he wasn't with Maris's team. He had a federal ID, but it wasn't the same agency as the others. He asked me specifically whether you had mentioned the location of your personal records to anyone in the building." Emily went very still. "I didn't tell him anything," Galvez said. "I said I didn't know, but he left about 10 minutes ago and I thought—" She exhaled. "I thought you should know." Emily stood up. Her mind was already moving through the implications, fast and clean, the way it moved when she was working a problem that had a clock on it. The personal logs. 2 years of documentation in the second bedroom of her apartment, in a filing cabinet she'd never unpacked. Time-stamped, handwritten, cross-referenced against the hospital's own records. The documentation that Maris had called contemporaneous and that the IG's office considered the clearest independent record of what Voss had done and when. The message earlier tonight from the administrative extension. "Voss knows you kept external records." He'd known. Which meant someone had told him. Which meant somewhere in the chain between the moment she'd first mentioned the logs in the conference room with Halcott at 11 a.m. and right now, there was a leak that she had not identified. "What did he look like?" she said. Galvez described him. Average height, dark coat, nondescript in the specific way that people who work certain jobs sometimes were. Federal ID, agency she couldn't read the acronym on clearly. Emily was already moving toward the exit, pulling her phone out, pulling up Maris's number. Maris picked up on the second ring. She sounded awake, which tracked. Emily doubted Maris slept much during active investigations. Someone from a different federal agency was on my floor asking about my personal logs, Emily said. He's gone now. I need to know if that was sanctioned. A pause. It was very short. No, Maris said. It was not. Then who was it? Another pause, longer. I don't know yet. Her voice had shifted into the register of someone solving a problem in real time. Emily, I need you to tell me exactly where your personal records are. My apartment. Are they secured? Filing cabinet. It's locked. Is anyone else in your apartment? No? I'm sending 2 MPs to your address right now. She heard Maris moving, the background sounds of wherever she was shifting around her. Do not go to your apartment alone. Wait for them and go together. Maris. Emily. Her voice was precise and not unkind. If someone in this investigation is trying to access your documentation before tomorrow's board session, those records are the reason why. They are the most concrete evidence of the timeline of what Voss did, and they predate everything that the auditors found today. A breath. Someone doesn't want them to reach that board session. The lobby of the hospital was quiet around her. One security guard at the desk. The automatic doors showing her the empty ambulance bay and the dark parking lot beyond it. She thought about her apartment, 12 minutes away. 3rd floor. 2nd bedroom with the filing cabinet she'd called paranoid by her last supervisor at a hospital 3 states ago, who'd said you can't spend your whole career assuming someone's going to come after your records, Emily. She'd kept the cabinet anyway. How fast can the MPs get there, she said. 12 minutes. I'll meet them there? Emily. I'll be careful, she said. Send them. She hung up and pushed through the lobby doors into the cold mountain air, and she was at her car when her phone buzzed one more time. Unknown number. She looked at it for a second. Then she answered. Silence on the other end. Not dead silence, but the kind with ambient noise behind it. A room somewhere, someone breathing. Then a voice she did not recognize. Male, unhurried, with the specific flatness of someone reading off a script they'd written themselves. Ms. Carter, I think we should talk before this goes any further. A pause. There are things in those records of yours that would be better handled privately, for everyone's benefit. She stood in the parking lot with the mountain air cold on her face and the hospital lights behind her, and the sky above the Appalachian Ridge showing the first very faint suggestion of pre-dawn gray. Who is this? She said. Someone who understands that what happens tomorrow morning is going to affect a lot of people beyond Harlan Voss. Another pause. You're a reasonable person, Ms. Carter. We'd like to have a reasonable conversation. She looked at her car. At the road beyond the parking lot that led to her apartment, and a filing cabinet that 12 minutes of MP travel time stood between and whatever this phone call was the beginning of. Give me your name, she said. That's not how this works. Then we don't have anything to talk about, she said, and ended the call. She got in the car. She drove. 3 blocks from the hospital, she caught movement in her rearview mirror. Headlights that had been in the lot when she left and were now on the same street, maintaining the same distance. She noted it without reacting. She changed lanes once, watched the headlights. They changed lanes. She called Maris back. I have a tail, she said. Maris didn't hesitate. Don't go to your apartment. Drive to the Redstone PD, 14 Commerce Street. I'm calling ahead. The MPs will redirect. She changed course. The headlights followed for 4 more blocks, then dropped back and turned off at the intersection of Marsh and 6th, disappearing into the pre-dawn grid of the city. She sat outside the police department for 30 seconds before going in. Inside her apartment, in the 2nd bedroom, in the locked filing cabinet, were 2 years of documentation that were going to walk into a boardroom in 6 hours and dismantle everything that Harlan Voss had spent 6 years building. And somebody in this city, with a federal ID she couldn't trace and a phone number she didn't recognize, had just spent the last 10 minutes trying to make sure they didn't. The Redstone Police Department at 2:30 a.m. had the exhausted fluorescent quality of a building that never fully closed and never fully woke up. A desk sergeant processed her arrival without visible surprise. Maris had called ahead, and there was already a federal liaison on the phone when Emily walked in, and the two MPs arrived 9 minutes later in a vehicle that still had road dust on it from wherever they'd been redirected from. She didn't sleep in the waiting room. She sat in a plastic chair that was somehow worse than the one in the hospital family lounge, and went through the implications of the phone call, the way she went through clinical problems, systematically, without rushing to conclusions she didn't have evidence for yet. Someone had her number. Someone with access to federal identification, or something that looked like it. Someone who had been watching the investigation develop throughout the day and had waited until 2 a.m., until the building was quiet and she was isolated, to make a move that was either intimidation or a genuine attempt to reach the records before morning. The tale confirmed it was the latter. Intimidation didn't follow you in a car. The MPs brought a lockbox. She told them what was in the filing cabinet and where the key was and sent them with her apartment key and Maris's direct number. They came back 43 minutes later with the cabinet files inside the lockbox, and the MP who handed it to her said, "The apartment was clear, ma'am. Nobody had been inside." And she felt something she didn't have a clean name for, relief adjacent to something more complicated, the feeling of having been right about a threat without that rightness, making it less disturbing. She called Maris. "The number traced to a prepaid device," Maris said. "The vehicle we believe was tailing you was a rental. We're working it." A pause. "Emily, I need you to understand something. What happened tonight is a separate thread from Voss. It's connected to the vendor network, the shell entities. There are people with financial exposure in this investigation who are not employed by Crestview and who have significantly more resources than Harlan Voss. Meaning the 4.3 million is not the whole picture. The auditors believe it's closer to 11 million when the other regional centers are fully accounted for." Maris let that land. Voss was the hospital-level operator. He was not the architect. Emily sat with that for a moment. Who was? That's what the federal investigation is going to establish. And your records, the timeline, the documentation of when specific complaints were filed and what happened to them are going to help establish when this pattern began and who had knowledge of it. She paused. Which is why someone wanted them. Are my records secure now? They're being digitized and entered into federal evidence custody as we speak. The originals will be preserved. A pause. Emily, go get some sleep. The board session is at 8 and you need to be functional for it. She slept for 3 hours on a cot in a back room that the desk sergeant offered with the matter-of-fact practicality of someone who had seen stranger situations. It was not good sleep, but it was sleep. She woke at 6:15, washed her face in the precinct bathroom, bought coffee from the machine in the hallway, and drove back to the hospital in the early mountain light. Pruitt's 6 a.m. numbers were the best they'd been since surgery. Saturday 98, pressure 110/72, heart rate 74. She read the overnight chart notes standing at the foot of his bed, and when she looked up he was awake, watching her with the slightly unfocused alertness of someone in managed post-surgical pain. "You're still here," he said. His voice was rough. "I work here." She paused. "Technically." "What does that mean?" "It means it's complicated and you should focus on breathing." She came closer, checked the drain output, made a note. "How's the pain?" 4, maybe 5. He shifted slightly and immediately regretted it. She could see it in the tightening around his eyes. 3. "You don't have to lie to me." 6, he said. "But I've had worse." She adjusted the notation for the next pain assessment window. "Reeves was in this morning. She checked on you." "I know. She cried a little and then told me she didn't." "Sounds about right." She capped the pen. "You're going to be here a few weeks. The rebleed complicated the recovery timeline, but Brecht is satisfied with the repair and your numbers are heading the right direction." He was quiet for a moment. His eyes went to the window, where the morning light was coming in at a low angle and hitting the institutional wall in a way that almost looked warm. "Is it true?" he said. "What Reeves told me. About the administrator. About what they found." "Which part?" "All of it." She looked at him. He was 24 years old, and he'd spent the last 18 hours closer to not making it than he probably knew, and he was asking her for honest information because he was the kind of person who needed honest information to function, and she recognized that because she was the same kind of person. "Yes," she said, "it's true." He absorbed that. "And they fired you for—" "They tried to." Something in his expression shifted. "You stayed anyway." "I stayed because you needed someone who knew what they were doing." She picked up the chart. "Don't make it more dramatic than that." He almost smiled. It pulled at something around his surgical site, and he stopped. "Too late," he said. She left him to rest and went to find Wall, who was already sitting up and had somehow acquired a cup of actual coffee from somewhere, which she was fairly sure was not on his post-surgical dietary plan, but which she chose not to address because he looked like a man who had earned a cup of coffee, and picking that particular battle served no one. 8 o'clock, he said when he saw her. "I know. You ready?" She thought about the filing cabinet contents now in federal evidence custody, about 12 other people who had said yes to Rourke without hesitation, about 2 years of documentation she'd kept in a room she'd never fully unpacked, in a building she'd never fully believed was going to let her stay, because she'd learned in enough environments to document everything and trust the record you controlled. "Yes," she said. The board session was in the large conference room on the second floor, the one used for administrative presentations, with a long table and chairs for 15 and a projector screen at the far end that someone had not retracted and that now showed the blank white of a powered-down system. Meredith Halcott was already there when Emily arrived at 7:52, seated at the head of the table with the mechanical pencil and notebook, and around her were 8 other board members, 2 of whom Emily recognized from the hospital website's governance page, and 6 of whom she didn't. Maris was present. Greer from the IG's office was present. 2 attorneys, one representing the hospital, one she didn't recognize, were present. Dennis Rourke was in a chair along the wall, which was not a board seat, but which nobody appeared to have disputed. There was no Harlan Voss. He was on the cardiac unit under federal detainer with an attorney who had arrived at 11 p.m. and been briefed on a situation that the attorney's billing rate was going to reflect. Halcott called the session to order at 8:02 and spent exactly 4 minutes on procedural framing, which Emily suspected was shorter than the board's normal procedural framing by a significant margin. Then she turned the floor to Greer, who opened a laptop and delivered the summary of the IG's findings in the specific mode of federal investigators delivering findings: precise, sequential, attributed, with documentary evidence projected on the screen behind him that made the retracted projector suddenly relevant. The room heard it all. The 4 regional medical centers, the 6 years, the shell vendor entities, the $11 million in preliminary accounting, the personnel files, 14 of them, modified over time to support terminations and disciplinary actions that protected Voss's operating environment and eliminated staff members who had noticed things they weren't supposed to notice. When Greer put Emily's service record on the screen next to the termination paperwork Voss had filed, the contrast did not require explanation. Several board members looked at the projection for a long time without speaking. Then Greer said, "We also have audio documentation from the termination meeting on the morning of the incident." He looked at Halcott. The administrator recorded meetings in that conference room over a 3-year period. The recordings were found in an encrypted file partition on his administrative system. The recording from yesterday morning directly contradicts the stated basis for Ms. Carter's termination. The attorney Emily didn't recognize, Voss's, she understood now, made a brief objection that Greer acknowledged and set aside with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been making and receiving objections in federal proceedings for a long time. The audio played for 40 seconds. Voss's voice, clear and unhurried. In the conference room they were 2 floors above, telling Sandra Reeve 3 days prior to the termination meeting that the Ardell complaint needed to be ready before Carter's next shift evaluation, and that the call log discrepancy needed to be resolved in the system before anyone pulled it. 3 days prior. The complaint from Ardell's wife had not yet been filed when Voss said those words. The room was completely quiet when Greer stopped the playback. Halcott looked at the projection for a moment. Then she looked at Emily. "Miss Carter," she said. Her voice was very level. "On behalf of this board, I want to formally state that your termination was unlawful, retaliatory, and without factual basis. The board acknowledges full institutional responsibility for the environment that made this possible." She paused. "I want to say that plainly and on record, without qualification." Emily looked at her. She'd thought, in this abstract, about what this moment would feel like. She'd thought it would feel like something large and definitive, a wave, a door closing, a weight leaving. What it actually felt like was smaller and more real than that. It felt like being told you were right about something you'd always known you were right about, and the knowing already being there meant the confirmation was less about information and more about witness. Somebody finally seen what had been true all along. "Thank you," she said. It was not enough. It also was, in that moment, exactly right. The session continued for another 2 hours. Sandra Reeves' employment was suspended pending the licensing board review. A second supervisor, a man named Taft, who Emily had barely interacted with, had already submitted a voluntary resignation at 7 a.m. through his own attorney. The board voted unanimously to engage an independent firm to conduct a full audit of all terminations and disciplinary actions under Voss's tenure, going back to the beginning. Any staff member whose records showed alteration would be contacted, reviewed, and offered reinstatement if appropriate. 14 names, 3 who had left healthcare. She thought about them during the vote, about the specific weight of someone telling you that the complaint against you was real, was documented, was on file, and watching the system accept that version because the person who built the version had more institutional power than you did. About making the calculation, fight it and be ground down further, or go, and choosing to go and then carrying that choice. She was going to write to each of them personally. She'd decided that at some point during the night, without marking the exact moment, it wasn't a debt she owed them. It was something else. The recognition that justice happening publicly for one person did not automatically reach the people who'd already left the room. After the session, she found Rourke in the hallway. He looked at her face and read it with the accuracy of someone who had known her through situations where faces meant something. "How do you feel?" he said. "Like I've been awake for 30 hours. Besides that." She thought about it. The filing cabinet in the second bedroom that she'd never unpacked. The habit of documentation she'd carried from deployment to deployment and then into civilian life because she'd never fully trusted that the environment around her would accurately reflect what happened inside it. The 2 years at Crestview of logging every discrepancy and every flagged error and every interaction she'd found significant, not because she'd known this was coming, but because she hadn't known it wasn't. "I feel like I was right to be careful," she said. Rourke nodded. "You were always right to be careful." "I was also right that the work mattered, the actual work, the patients." She looked at the corridor, at the hospital around them, at the ordinary mid-morning movement of a place that had been through something significant and was now, in the way that institutions did, continuing. "I didn't stay last night because of the investigation or the records or any of it. I stayed because Pruitt needed a second set of hands in the OR, and Tilton was waiting on a neurosurgeon, and Wall had a surgical drain that needed measuring at 6. "I know," Rourke said. "I need you to understand that distinction," she said, "because I think it matters." He looked at her for a moment. "It matters," he said simply. She went back to the floor. Wall was being evaluated for discharge planning when she stopped by at noon. He was sitting up fully dressed, which the nursing staff had apparently not been able to prevent, in his uniform shirt with the lower half of him in hospital-issue pants because the uniform trousers didn't accommodate the leg splints. He looked ridiculous and completely unbothered by it. "Board session?" he said. "Done." "And?" "Termination formally rescinded. Full institutional acknowledgement. Independent audit of all personnel actions going back to the beginning." She sat down. "Voss will be transferred to federal custody when he's medically cleared. The financial charges are federal. The personnel conduct charges are being coordinated with the state." Wall was quiet for a moment. "The others?" "The 14. Independent review. Reinstatement offers where appropriate. The board is funding a compensation process." He looked at his hands. "Will they come back? The ones who left?" "Some of them won't be able to. They've built other lives. Others might." She paused. "The ones who had their complaints dismissed. There's going to be a formal process. The licensing board has been notified about the two supervisors. It's not fast, it's not clean, but it's moving. He looked at her. What about you? She'd been thinking about that since Maris's call the night before, about the consulting designation that Maris had mentioned twice, carefully, in the way she mentioned things she wanted Emily to hear without pressure, about what it meant to be in a place where the work was real, and the patients were people she'd been trained to help in specific ways that most clinical environments didn't utilize, and about whether there was a version of this that was sustainable. I've been offered a consulting position, she said, civilian contract, military medical liaison focused on trauma protocol development for regional hospitals serving areas with significant military populations. She looked at the window, essentially formalizing what I did yesterday, but with appropriate institutional support. And I told Maris I'd give her an answer by the end of the week. Wall nodded slowly. He didn't push. He had, she'd come to understand, the patience of someone who had given orders for long enough to know when pushing produced worse outcomes than waiting. There's also this, she said, and told him about the 14 files and her decision to write to each person. He was quiet for a long moment. Emily, he said. His voice had gone to something different, lower, more careful, the voice he used when he was saying something he'd considered and not just responding. I've been in command for a long time. I've made good decisions and bad ones. The bad ones, the ones where someone under my authority was failed by the system I was running, those are the ones that stay. He paused. The fact that you're thinking about writing to them, that's not a small thing. It's letters, she said. It's witness, he said. Don't undersell it. She went back to the floor one more time, because there was always one more time, always a chart to finish or a patient to check or a handoff to complete. And it was in the middle of writing the afternoon nursing report on Tilton's transfer preparation that she looked up and saw the lobby. It had been building gradually enough that she hadn't registered it consciously. The families who'd been called in, parents and spouses and siblings of the soldiers who'd been transported yesterday, arriving through the morning in twos and threes, receiving updates and gathering in the family areas and the waiting rooms. By 2 in the afternoon, there were perhaps 60 people in the hospital who had come because someone they cared about had nearly not made it. She didn't notice them as a group until one of them walked up to the nurses' station and stood there until she looked up. She was in her mid-50s, in the specific casual dress of someone who had driven through the night to get somewhere. She looked like she hadn't slept. She had Pruitt's jaw. "Are you Carter?" the woman said. Emily set down the pen. "Yes." "I'm Dale's mother, Kathleen Pruitt." She stopped. Her voice was doing the thing that voices did when they'd been held together through a long drive and a long night, and were now, in the presence of the person they'd come to find, beginning to let go of the tension that had been holding them. "The surgeon told me about the rebleed, about what you did in the OR." She stopped again. Emily waited. "He's my only one," Kathleen Pruitt said. "He's all I've got." Emily stood up. She came around the station and stood in front of this woman who had driven through the night and was now standing in a hospital lobby holding herself together by main force of will. She did not give her a speech. She did not use any of the language that hospitals used when they wanted to make families feel managed. "He's going to be all right," she said. "He's got a long recovery ahead, and he's going to be frustrated with it before it's done. But he's going to be all right." Kathleen Pruitt nodded. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. "Thank you," she said. It came out rough and genuine, without performance. "Go see him," Emily said. "He's been awake since 6 asking about his unit." Kathleen Pruitt squared herself and walked toward the elevator, and Emily watched her go, and then she went back to the nurses' station and picked up the pen and finished the report. 3 weeks later, Harlan Voss was transferred from the cardiac unit to federal custody. He was arraigned on 11 counts of fraud, 4 counts of obstruction, and 2 counts related to the falsification of official records. The arraignment was public record, which meant it was in the Redstone paper on a Thursday morning, which meant the people who had worked under him for 11 years, the nurses and techs and unit secretaries and orderlies who had spent years navigating his particular kind of institutional authority, read about it with their coffee. Sandra Reeves' nursing license was suspended pending investigation. It was not revoked immediately because these processes took time, and Emily knew enough about institutional processes not to mistake suspension for resolution. But it was moving. The independent audit identified 9 additional personnel actions over 6 years that showed evidence of alteration or improper coordination. Of those 9, 4 individuals were located and offered formal reinstatement through the hospital's new HR structure. 2 accepted. 1 had moved to a different healthcare field and declined with what the board chair described in her summary as understandable finality. 1 did not respond. Emily wrote to all 14. She wrote by hand, which took longer than typing, and she said specific things in each letter. Not the same things, because they were not the same people, and what had happened to each of them was not identical. And she'd read each file carefully enough to know the difference. She said what she knew, and what the investigation had established, and what was being done. And she said that she had been one of them, and that she understood something about the particular weight of being told that the institution's version of events was the real one. She got 9 responses. 2 were brief and functional. Receipt of information, thank you. 3 were longer. 1 was from the person who had left the state, a nurse named Verity Carmack, who had been terminated 4 years ago after filing a safety report about medication tracking and who was now working in a school health program in a different part of the country, and who wrote back 2 pages in small, even handwriting that said, among other things, I stopped believing that anyone in that building would ever tell the truth about what happened. I'm not sure I believe it yet, completely, but I'm glad someone said it. Emily kept that letter, not in a filing cabinet. On the desk in the second bedroom that she'd finally unpacked, Maris called on a Friday afternoon in the 4th week. I need your answer, she said. Emily was standing in her kitchen. The coffee was hot. The mountains outside her window were doing what Appalachian mountains did in late afternoon in October, catching the light at an angle that made them look like something constructed rather than grown, the ridgeline sharp against a sky that had gone the particular blue of altitude. She thought about what she'd told Rourke, about the distinction between staying because of the investigation and staying because of Pruitt and Tilton and Wall and Kathleen Pruitt walking toward the elevator with her shoulders squared, about the work mattering separate from whether the institution around it was worthy of it. She thought about Verity Carmack, who had left the state, about the 8 people who had come through the Route 9 incident and survived, and the 3 who had needed surgeries she'd helped coordinate, and Pruitt specifically, who was currently in a rehabilitation facility 40 minutes from Redstone, doing the frustrating, unglamorous, necessary work of getting a chest to heal properly. She thought about the second bedroom desk and the letter, and what it meant to have finally unpacked the room. Yes, she said. Maris was quiet for exactly 1 second. Good, she said. I'll have the paperwork to you by Monday. Maris? Yes. The other regional centers, the ones connected to the vendor network, do they have the same problem? She meant the personnel files, the pattern of eliminating staff who noticed things. Maris's pause this time was slightly longer. We're looking, she said. That's all I can tell you right now. Then I'll be available, Emily said. She hung up, drank the coffee, looked at the mountains. The thing about being dismissed, about being told, quietly and institutionally and in front of witnesses, that your record didn't match your value, that your observations weren't credible, that the system had already decided what the truth was before you opened your mouth. The thing about it was that it worked on you in ways you didn't always register in real time. It worked like water on stone. You got up every morning and went to the floor and did the job and documented everything and told yourself that the work was enough and the record was the record. And somewhere underneath all of that, in a place that wasn't accessible during a 12-hour shift, the question lived, what if they're right? What if the version of you that they've decided on is more real than the one you know? She'd had that question for 2 years. She'd never answered it directly because the direct engagement with it was exactly what they were counting on. Instead, she'd done what she'd always done. She'd worked. She'd documented. She'd kept the cabinet. And when everything came apart, the record was there. Not because she'd anticipated this specific sequence of events, because she'd known, in the way people who have survived enough institutional failure know it, that the only protection against a version of you that someone else controls is the version you maintain yourself. Pruitt called her on a Tuesday from his rehab facility. He said he'd been cleared for phone use, and the first person he'd decided to use it on was her, which she told him was questionable decision-making. He laughed and then said, "Ow," and then told her his physical therapist was, in his words, a sadist who was making him breathe into a spirometer 40 times a day, and that he thought she'd probably approved of this if she knew. She told him his physical therapist sounded excellent. He laughed again, more carefully this time. "When do you get out?" she said. 3 more weeks. Maybe 2.5 if I stop telling the spirometer what I think of it." "Then stop telling the spirometer what you think of it." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. She had started her new position on a Monday, 3.5 weeks after the morning she'd carried her bag out through the lobby of Crestview Medical Center with a security guard holding the door. The position was civilian contract, military liaison, and it meant she split her time between the hospital's trauma team in a formal advisory capacity and the regional military medical coordination office that Maris ran out of a building 20 minutes from the hospital. It was more complicated than floor nursing. It required meetings she found less interesting than clinical work, and paperwork she found less interesting than the meetings, and the navigation of institutional relationships between civilian and military medical systems that were not naturally inclined toward each other. It also meant that she was, for the first time in 2 years, in a position that matched what she was capable of, and the specific weight of operating below your own capacity was something she only fully felt the absence of once it was gone. She kept her personal log. She always would. On the day Voss's federal indictment was formally announced, 6 counts of financial fraud confirmed, with additional charges pending, she was in the trauma bay at Crestview, working a simulation exercise with 4 ER residents who had not been in the building on the day of the Route 9 incident and who knew her only as the military liaison who expected precise answers and gave precise information in return. Anita texted her the news during a break. She read it, put the phone in her pocket, went back to the simulation. The residents were learning a mass casualty triage protocol that she had helped redesign over the past 3 weeks, pulling from both military field medicine and the specific lessons of the Route 9 response. It was not a perfect protocol. Protocols were never perfect. The situations they were designed for were never the exact situations they encountered, and the gap between design and application was where people got hurt if you hadn't trained them to think rather than just execute. She was training them to think. She ran them through a scenario, watched them problem solve, caught 3 errors and made them visible without making them shameful. Just the next data point, here's what happened, here's why it matters, here's the correction. One of the residents, a woman named Osei, who was going to be very good in 5 years, asked a question that nobody in the room knew the answer to, and Emily said, "Good question. I don't know the answer offhand. Let's find it," and pulled up the reference together. After the simulation, Osei stayed back. "I heard about what happened here," she said, carefully, not wanting to step wrong. "In September, the Convoy accident." "Yes." "Is it true that you'd been terminated that morning?" Emily looked at her. Osei was maybe 26, in her 3rd year, with the specific combination of intelligence and uncertainty that good residents had before confidence caught up to competence. She was asking the question the way young people asked questions about the hard things, directly, because they hadn't yet learned that directness was sometimes penalized. "Yes," Emily said, "and you came back anyway." "People needed help." Osei was quiet for a moment. She stopped, started again. "I've been thinking about what it means to stay when the institution fails you, whether that's naive or whether it's..." She shook her head. "I don't know what the word is." Emily thought about it. About Verity Carmack, who had left. About the 2 people who'd accepted reinstatement and the one who'd declined with understandable finality. About the fact that leaving was not wrong and staying was not automatically noble, and the difference between the two was not always legible from the outside. "It's not about the institution," she said finally. "The institution is going to fail. Most of them do, at some point, in some way. The question is whether the work itself is worth staying for." She paused. "And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. And you have to know which one you're looking at." Osei nodded slowly. "How do you know?" Emily thought about Pruitt on the gurney, asking where the pain was. About Tilton in the bed, trying to hide his fear under military composure. About Kathleen Pruitt walking toward the elevator with her shoulders squared. "You look at the patient," she said, "not at the institution. The patient right in front of you, needing something specific that you know how to give. She picked up the protocol folder. If that's still real, if you can still see that person clearly, you're not done. She handed Osei the folder. Osei took it. They went back to work. Outside, the mountains stood where they'd always stood. The hospital ran its ordinary Wednesday. Somewhere on the second floor, in a room with a long table and a projector screen, someone was conducting an exit interview with a staff member who had filed a formal complaint about a documentation irregularity, and the new HR director said, appointed 6 weeks ago, brought in from outside the system specifically because she was from outside the system, was listening to every word. Things were not fixed. Things were not clean. The vendor network investigation was ongoing, which meant there were people with exposure still operating, still making calculations about what they could afford to let happen and what they needed to prevent. 2 of the 14 names in Voss's files had not responded to Emily's letters, and she didn't know what that silence meant and might never know. The work of rebuilding trust in an institution that had systematically violated it was slow and structural and would outlast any single person's involvement, including hers. And she would do her part of it and document everything and keep the records in a room she'd finally finished unpacking. That was what she knew how to do. That was, when everything else was stripped away, what she had always known how to do. She hadn't come back to prove them wrong. She hadn't come back to be seen, to be vindicated, to watch the version they'd built of her collapse under the weight of what was actually true. She'd come back because people were hurt, and she knew how to help. And there was no version of herself that could have driven past those helicopters and gone home. The rest of it, the records, the board session, the indictment, the letter from Verity Carmack that sat on a desk in a room that no longer had a filing cabinet in it. All of that was what happened when you refused to become the person they decided you were. Quiet doesn't mean absent. Patience doesn't mean surrender. And the person they dismiss is often exactly the person they can't afford to lose. Emily Carter knew who she was. She always had.